Good afternoon. I'm Janice Weiner from CDER's Office of Regulatory Policy, and I'm pleased to be here at the Pharmaceutical Quality Symposium to provide an overview of the deemed to be a license provision of the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act of 2009, or BPCI Act. As we'll discuss, this is the statutory provision that requires that on March 23rd, 2020, an approved application for a biological product under Section 505 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act will be deemed to be a license for the biological product. In other words, an approved biologics license application under Section 351 of the Public Health Service Act. We informally refer to this statutory provision as the transition provision. I'll begin my presentation by providing an overview of the transition provision of the BPCI Act. I'll discuss the amended statutory definition of biological product and FDA's interpretation of the transition provision. I'll also provide an overview of FDA's approach to implementation of the transition provision with respect to proposed products and approved products. Finally, I'll highlight additional considerations related to product labeling and supplements to approved applications. The BPCI Act amended the statutory definition of a biological product to include a protein, except any chemically synthesized polypeptide. And this has the effect of requiring that protein products that have historically been regulated as drugs under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, such as insulin and human growth hormone, to be regulated as biological products under the Public Health Service Act. The BPCI Act sets out a 10-year transition scheme. The statute describes requirements for submission of an application for a biological product under the amended definition during a 10-year transition period ending on March 23rd, 2020, which is 10 years after the date of enactment of the BPCI Act. On March 23rd, 2020, an approved application for a biological product will be deemed to be a license for the biological product under Section 351 of the Public Health Service Act. After March 23rd, 2020, all sponsors seeking approval of a biological product will need to submit a BLA, either a standalone BLA under Section 351A of the Public Health Service Act, or a BLA for a proposed biosimilar or interchangeable product under Section 351K of the Public Health Service Act. The transition of biological products currently approved under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to the Public Health Service Act will allow for the submission of applications for products that are biosimilar to or interchangeable with these transition products. FDA is working to ensure that there is a seamless transition of approved NDAs for biological products to deemed BLAs, and that there are minimal impacts on manufacturers and patients. FDA's approach is intended to provide clarity and predictability to manufacturers. The agency has provided a number of resources related to the transition, which are available on an FDA webpage titled the Deemed to be a License provision. I've included a link to that webpage on this slide for ease of reference. FDA has issued final guidance describing our interpretation of the Deemed to be a License provision of the BPCI Act, and we also have issued a companion Q&A draft guidance that's intended to provide answers to common questions about the agency's interpretation of this statutory provision. FDA also has issued a proposed rule on definition of the term biological product that would codify FDA's interpretation of the statutory terms protein and chemically synthesized polypeptide, and that's intended to clarify the statutory framework under which these products will be regulated. FDA also has issued a proposed rule on BLAs and master files. And finally, the agency has compiled a preliminary list of approved NDAs for biological products that will be deemed BLAs on March 23rd, 2020. This slide just provides some examples of biological products approved under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. We originally included these examples in a draft guidance on the transition that was issued in 2016 and that we recently finalized last December. As I noted when I described available resources on the transition, FDA has compiled a preliminary list of 91 approved NDAs for biological products that will be deemed BLAs on March 23rd, 2020. And this preliminary list is available on the agency's webpage on the Deemed to be a License provision. And that's intended to enhance transparency and facilitate planning for the transition. The BPCI Act amended the statutory definition of a biological product in Section 351I1 of the Public Health Service Act. As amended, a biological product includes a protein, except any chemically synthesized polypeptide. The agency has described its interpretation of the statutory terms protein and chemically synthesized polypeptide in guidance and a proposed rule. FDA's interpretation reflects that, as a scientific matter, the terms protein and chemically synthesized polypeptide are distinguishable from a peptide and are used to describe larger chains of amino acids. Based on FDA scientific expertise and consideration of relevant literature, the agency is proposing to implement this scientific distinction with a Brightline interpretation that's intended to provide certainty to industry and minimize administrative complexity. This slide illustrates our Brightline interpretation of certain terms, and I've provided a brief narrative summary on the next slide for ease of reference. Starting at the bottom of the slide, we interpret the statutory term protein to mean any alpha amino acid polymer with a specific defined sequence that is greater than 40 amino acids in size. The statutory category of protein excludes any chemically synthesized polypeptide. Moving to the upper right portion of the slide, the agency interprets the statutory term chemically synthesized polypeptide to mean any alpha amino acid polymer that is made entirely by chemical synthesis and that is greater than 40 amino acids, but less than 100 amino acids in size. Finally, we interpret the term peptide to mean any polymer composed of 40 or fewer amino acids, even if it is recombinant or naturally sourced. Peptides and chemically synthesized polypeptides are not biological products and will continue to be regulated as drugs under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, unless they otherwise meet the statutory definition of a biological product on another basis, for example, a peptide vaccine. These are the interpretations that I provided in connection with the last slide. The effect of the amended statutory definition differs for proposed products and approved products. For proposed products, the BPCI Act describes the approval pathways that are available for submission of an application for a biological product. Beginning on March 23rd, 2010, the BPCI Act requires that an application for a biological product must be submitted under Section 351 of the Public Health Service Act in a BLA. However, this requirement is subject to an exception during a transition period ending on March 23rd, 2020. For approved products, the BPCI Act requires that on March 23rd, 2020, an approved application for a biological product under Section 505 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act will be deemed to be a license for the product under the Public Health Service Act and will be regulated under the Public Health Service Act. The statutory transition provision is limited to approved applications. The agency will not approve any application for a biological product under Section 505 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act after March 23, 2020. The agency has provided recommendations to sponsors in guidance to facilitate alignment of product development plans with FDA's interpretation of the transition provision of the BPCI Act. The guidance describes consideration for submission of a standalone BLA under Section 351A of the Public Health Service Act, or a BLA for a proposed biosimilar or interchangeable product under Section 351K of the Public Health Service Act. Sponsors seeking advice on development programs for proposed biological products may request a meeting with FDA in accordance with the PDUFA meeting types if they intend to submit a 351A BLA for a proposed biological product, or in accordance with the PSUFA meeting types if they intend to submit a 351K BLA for a proposed biosimilar or interchangeable biological product. With respect to approved NDAs for biological products, on March 23, 2020, approved NDAs, including an NDA approved through the 505(b)(2) pathway, will be deemed to be a 351A BLA. Any post-approval requirements or commitments associated with the NDA, for example, a post-marketing requirement related to pediatric assessments, would transfer to the deemed BLA. The application holder does not need to take any affirmative steps for its NDA to be deemed to be a BLA. FDA intends to send a letter to application holders on that March 23, 2020 transition date, advising that the approved NDA was deemed to be a BLA by operation of the statute at the stroke of midnight on March 23, 2020, and that the application no longer exists as an NDA. The letter will provide additional information, including the application number, and for predictability and to minimize burden, the agency intends to assign the same application number that was used for the approved NDA to the deemed BLA. So if an application holder had hypothetical NDA 012345, that application would be deemed to be BLA 012345 on the transition date. The letter also will include the license number that is assigned to the BLA holder for the product. And I'll mention the license number in a few slides in connection with certain labeling requirements as well. Upon the transition, the holder of a deemed BLA will be subject to applicable requirements under the Public Health Service Act and FDA regulations, and also will be subject to requirements under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that apply to BLAs. There are certain differences in labeling and CMC-related requirements for NDAs and BLAs. In the next presentation, quality-related considerations will be discussed, so I'll highlight certain labeling considerations later in this presentation. In general, the agency anticipates that the holder of an NDA for a biological product that is deemed to be a BLA will experience minimal disruption due to the differences in requirements. And I'd like to emphasize that the agency is committed to working with application holders to minimize any potential burden. I'm going to skip ahead a few slides and I'll return back to the labeling considerations. We recognize that there may be one or more supplements submitted to an approved NDA before March 23, 2020 that are not approved supplements as of the transition date. Such pending supplements may include prior approval supplements, for example, for efficacy, labeling, and/or CMC-related changes, or changes being affected supplements. To provide business certainty to application holders who seek to make changes to their products close in time to the transition date, the agency intends to administratively convert a pending supplement to an approved NDA to be a pending supplement to the deemed BLA upon the transition. At that time, such supplements will be reviewed under applicable BLA standards. The agency intends to maintain the same goal date, where applicable, for completion of its review of an administratively converted supplement. And if you're planning to submit a supplement close in time to the transition date and have questions, I'd encourage you to reach out to the applicable review division in CDER. I'd like to provide an overview of certain labeling considerations because there are certain requirements that you'll need to be aware of if you are submitting a supplement, for example, a CMC-related supplement that includes proposed changes to labeling that require FDA approval. The holder of a deemed BLA will need to revise product labeling to conform to labeling requirements for biological products regulated under the Public Health Service Act. Now, most labeling requirements are the same for NDAs and BLAs. However, there are certain minor differences in requirements for each package, for example, carton and container labeling, and also the prescribing information for biological products and BLAs. And an overview of key labeling differences is available in the transition Q&A guidance that I mentioned as being available as a resource. For example, the Public Health Service Act requires that each package of a biological product is plainly marked with the name, address, and applicable license number of the manufacturer of the biological product. And the agency recognizes that holders of deemed BLAs may need time to revise their labeling to conform to these labeling requirements and may not be able to make certain revisions until they receive information in the letter that FDA intends to send on the transition date, such as the license number for the deemed BLA. Accordingly, to minimize burden, the agency has announced a compliance policy. FDA generally does not intend to enforce these BLA-specific labeling requirements for deemed BLAs until March 23rd, 2025. And I'd refer you to the transition Q&A draft guidance for additional information regarding the compliance policy. To facilitate implementation, the agency recommends that the holder of a deemed BLA submit a prior approval supplement with the proposed BLA-specific labeling revisions during the first 2 years of that 5-year compliance period, between March 23, 2020 and March 23, 2022. If the holder of a deemed BLA has an administratively converted supplement that includes proposed revisions to labeling, or submits a supplement that includes proposed revisions to product labeling after the transition date, the BLA-specific labeling requirements will need to be addressed before the supplement can be approved. The holder of a deemed BLA should coordinate BLA-specific revisions to prescribing information, for example, with the corresponding revisions to carton and container labeling to ensure consistency among the different types of labeling for the biological product. Looking ahead to the transition. On March 23, 2020, FDA plans to remove NDAs for biological product from the Orange Book. Such products will no longer exist as listed drugs. The Orange Book lists products approved under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. FDA's Purple Book lists products licensed under the Public Health Service Act. Biological products approved in NDAs that are deemed BLAs will be listed in the Purple Book on or shortly after March 23, 2020. As I previously mentioned, a 351K BLA can be submitted for a proposed biosimilar or interchangeable product to a reference product that is the subject of a deemed BLA upon the March 23, 2020 transition. The agency also will be making updates to other databases to reflect the transition. Thank you very much for your attention.
Our next speaker